The courtroom was supposed to be routine that day. Another docket filled. Another session where Judge Judy's sharp questions would slice through excuses and evasions. The audience had gathered the way they always did, whispering with anticipation, eager to witness the woman whose reputation stretched far beyond the walls of any courtroom. For decades, Judge Judy had been a figure of authority and command, someone who carried the weight of experience not as decoration, but as weapon. Yet on this day, something different stirred in the air, something heavier. No one could predict that the first words uttered by a single heckler would ignite a confrontation so powerful that it would redefine the meaning of respect itself. She called herself Karen, loud, brash, unfiltered, the type who thrived on spectacle rather than substance. She was known for her interruptions, for her willingness to sneer at anyone who stood taller than her. But even by her standards, what she said next carried a venom that silenced the air. With an exaggerated laugh, she leaned forward, and in a tone dripping with mockery, said the words that would echo for the rest of the session. "That law degree of yours doesn't mean much, does it? Anybody can wave a piece of paper. It doesn't make you smarter than the rest of us." The gasp was immediate. It was as if someone had shattered glass in the middle of the room. People exchanged glances, unsure if they had heard correctly. Did this woman, this self-styled critic, just dismiss the lifetime of experience that Judge Judy carried? Did she just reduce decades of hard-won battles, countless cases, and a career that had reshaped the way Americans viewed justice into nothing more than a piece of paper? The arrogance in Karen's voice was more than an insult. It was an attempt to strip credibility, to question authority, to unravel the very fabric of what the courtroom represented. For a moment, the room froze. It wasn't just the audience, who waited. Even the cameras seemed to still, their lenses focused sharply on the quiet figure behind the bench. Judge Judy did not move. She did not rush to answer. She didn't even blink. Instead, her silence itself became the weapon. Her eyes locked on Karen, and in that pause, something far more powerful than anger began to take shape. It was the calm before the storm, the moment when strength reveals itself not in volume but in unshakable composure. And then came the reveal, subtle at first, but unmistakable. Judge Judy leaned forward, her voice measured, steady, carrying the kind of weight that silence had sharpened. She acknowledged the mockery, yes, but she framed it as more than a personal insult. She exposed it for what it was, a symptom of a deeper arrogance, the belief that authority can be dismissed simply because it makes someone uncomfortable. She reminded the room, not with shouting but with facts, that her law degree was not the source of her power. It was merely the door she had walked through. What had kept her standing, what had forged her reputation, what had cemented her authority, were the thousands of battles fought in courtrooms, the millions of lives her decisions had touched, and the unflinching consistency with which she had held truth above convenience. Yet even as she revealed this, she left something deliberately hidden. She did not unleash the full force of her rebuttal. Not yet. She withheld it, kept it coiled, waiting like a spring. The audience could sense it. Karen could sense it. This wasn't the end of the exchange. It was the beginning of a dismantling so thorough that it would leave Karen exposed, her arrogance reduced to dust. Judy had revealed just enough to remind everyone who she was, but had kept back enough to ensure that the confrontation still held a promise, something bigger, sharper, devastating, still to come. Karen smirked, mistaking Judy's restraint for weakness. But what Karen failed to understand was that Judge Judy had been in this position countless times before. She knew the power of timing. She knew the value of letting an opponent feel safe for just long enough to overstep, to trap themselves in the very arrogance they weaponized. Judy was not just defending a degree, she was defending the principle behind it, the truth that authority built on justice cannot be erased by mockery. The audience leaned forward, their anticipation thick, as a tide pulling them closer. They weren't just watching a courtroom exchange. They were witnessing a duel between arrogance and credibility, between mockery and mastery. And as the silence stretched, every eye in the room turned toward Judge Judy, waiting for the moment they knew was coming. She didn't need to raise her voice, she didn't need to trade insults. All she needed was to remind Karen, and everyone watching, that respect is not given and it cannot be stolen. It is earned. The hook had been set, the claim had been made, and the hidden promise that Judge Judy was about to deliver the most devastating rebuttal the room had ever seen, hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. What Karen thought was a clever insult was about to become the very stage upon which she would be dismantled, not by rage, but by reason. Not by shouting, but by truth. And once Judy began, nothing Karen could say would be able to stop the tide. Because this was not just about a law degree. This was not about one woman mocking another. This was about the very idea of credibility itself. Could arrogance tear down what decades of work had built? Or would the truth stand taller than the sneers of mockery? That was the battle being drawn. That was the clash about to unfold. And for those watching, both inside the courtroom and across the cameras that would soon beam this moment to millions, the anticipation was electric. Everyone knew they were standing at the edge of a confrontation that would not only silence Karen, it would remind the world why Judge Judy's name carried weight no insult could diminish. Now the only question was this: would Karen realize too late the storm she had invited upon herself? The insult still lingered in the air, but its weight went far beyond Karen's mocking words. Everyone in that courtroom understood. This was about more than one exchange. If Karen's jab was left unchallenged, if Judge Judy allowed that mockery to hang unanswered, it would not only bruise her credibility in the room, it would echo outside of it. Cameras were rolling, reporters were scribbling, and beyond those walls, an audience of millions would watch, replay, and judge for themselves. Whether authority had been shaken or reaffirmed, that was the true stake. A lifetime of work, decades of rulings, and the iron reputation that Judge Judy had earned could not be reduced to silence in this moment. Karen's arrogance was not simply personal, it was symbolic. It represented every voice that had ever dismissed education, every sneer that had belittled hard work, every arrogant whisper that tried to tear down someone who had climbed too high. If Karen's insult stood, then the message would spread like wildfire. That arrogance could defeat authority, that mockery could outweigh mastery, that noise could silence truth. But the opposite was also true, and this was where the tension deepened. If Judge Judy chose to respond, if she turned Karen's arrogance into a stage for clarity and conviction, then something unforgettable would happen. The world would not remember Karen's words, they would remember Judy's response. The insult would not define the moment, the comeback would. The stakes were not confined to the four walls of that courtroom. They stretched far beyond, into the very idea of what respect means. Millions watching at home were not just looking for drama, they were looking for proof. Proof that experience still mattered. Proof that truth could not be erased by mockery. Proof that even in an age of noise and spectacle, authority grounded in justice could still rise above arrogance. For Judge Judy, this was not just another case. It was a test of whether her voice still carried the force that had made her legendary. For Karen, it was a gamble she didn't realize she'd already lost. And for everyone else, it was a moment that would either confirm or shatter their belief in the power of integrity. The room braced itself. The insult had been thrown. The stakes had been set. Now the question was, who would own the moment when the storm broke? Karen's words still echoed when she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with a smirk that dared anyone to challenge her. She thought she had scored the moment, thought she had punctured the armor of a woman whose entire career was built on authority. The audience felt the sting of it too. Whispers rippled through the room, a nervous chorus of disbelief. Some shook their heads, others waited, their eyes darting between Judge Judy's calm face and Karen's mocking grin. Judge Judy didn't answer right away. That silence, that unbroken calm was her first strike. Where Karen used noise, Judy used composure. She placed her pen down slowly, deliberately, the click echoing like a gavel in the tense air. Then, with her eyes locked on Karen, she began to speak. Her tone wasn't sharp or angry, it was measured, precise, carrying the weight of 1,000 courtrooms behind it. She acknowledged Karen's remark, not to validate it, but to frame it. "So you think a degree is just paper, Judy?" began, her voice steady. "A decoration without meaning. Let me tell you what mine has done." The room leaned in. It wasn't boastful. It was factual. She outlined her journey, not in broad strokes, but in truths that landed like iron. She spoke of late nights buried in statutes, of trials fought not in theory but in sweat and persistence, of clients who came into her courtroom broken and walked out with dignity because the law had worked for them. She explained that her law degree wasn't a trophy on a shelf. It was a tool forged in the fire of real cases, sharpened against opposition, tested again and again until it became more than paper. Karen's smirk faltered, just slightly, as Judy's words drew the contrast. Karen had tried to reduce everything to a piece of paper. Judy had turned it into a story of battles fought and victories earned, but Judy wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her tone sharpening, not with anger, but with the precision of a scalpel. "You see, the measure of a lawyer isn't found in a diploma," she said, her gaze unflinching. "It's found in what that diploma has done in the real world. Mine has stood in the lives of people who needed justice when no one else would stand with them. That is what gives it weight. That is what makes it real." The silence was heavy, every word hanging in the air. Even the reporters lowered their pens for a moment, listening rather than scribbling. Karen shifted uncomfortably, tapping her fingers against the table, as if trying to mask the sting. She had expected outrage, maybe even defensiveness. Instead, Judy had answered with conviction, with a reality that left no room for dismissal. The first exchange was complete, and the room knew it. Karen had thrown her insult like a weapon. Judge Judy had caught it, broken it in her hands, and turned it back into truth. And everyone watching could sense it. The tide had just begun to turn. The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Karen leaned forward again, trying to recover her footing, her voice louder now, more desperate. "All that talk still doesn't change the fact that your degree is just a piece of paper. Anyone can claim authority, but that doesn't make you better than the rest of us." It was the spark Judge Judy had been waiting for. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Instead, she leaned in with the kind of focus that made the air itself feel heavier. Her words cut through the noise with surgical precision. "You're right. About one thing," she began. "A piece of paper by itself proves nothing. But when that paper represents decades of justice, when it has defended families, upheld rights, and held the powerful accountable, it stops being paper. It becomes proof of purpose." The room erupted into murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously. The audience leaned in closer, sensing they were witnessing something unforgettable. Judy pressed forward, her voice calm but commanding. "If you think mocking my degree diminishes me, you misunderstand completely. You don't diminish me, you expose yourself. Because in this room, authority is not given by arrogance. It is earned by truth." The silence that followed was thunderous. Karen's smirk had vanished, replaced by the uneasy stillness of someone who realized they had invited a storm they could not contain. Judge Judy had turned the insult into a declaration, and the crowd knew it. This was the moment that shifted the balance. The moment Judy didn't just defend herself, she owned the room. For a brief moment, Karen sat in silence, blinking under the weight of Judge Judy's words. But arrogance rarely knows when to stop. She shifted in her seat, crossed her arms again, and with a loud, dismissive laugh fired back. "You talk a big game, but you're hiding behind stories. Real lawyers, the ones who come from top schools, they don't waste time with theatrics. They argue with intellect, and you—" She gestured mockingly toward Judy. "You just argue with emotion." Gasps echoed across the courtroom. It was a bold accusation, one meant to claw back some ground, to paint Judy as a performer rather than a professional. But in truth, Karen's words only revealed desperation. She had seen the audience shift toward Judy, and this was her attempt to drag the spotlight back by questioning the very foundation of Judy's credibility. Judge Judy did not rush her response. She leaned back, folded her hands on the bench, and allowed Karen's words to hang in the air until they withered under their own weakness. Then, in a tone firm but controlled, she answered. "Emotion?" she repeated, letting the word linger. "No. What I argue with is reality. You see, the law isn't a debate club. It isn't an ivory tower where professors trade theories. It is a lifeline for people who would be crushed if no one defended them." She paused, then pressed forward with precision. "I've stood in courtrooms where eviction notices threatened to put children on the street. I've ruled in cases where lives depended on fairness being upheld, not on how impressive the name on a diploma sounded. Emotion? No, ma'am. That's called humanity. And if you think humanity has no place in the law, then you don't understand the law at all." The audience stirred again, a murmur of approval rolling through the chamber. Even the reporters, trained to stay detached, looked up from their notepads, captivated. Karen bristled, her face tightening. "You think your so-called humanity makes you better than everyone else?" she snapped, her tone rising. "It's convenient to hide behind sob stories when you don't have the education or prestige to back you up." The words struck like a final card played in desperation, and for a second the air thickened, but Judy's reply came sharp, unshaken. Education is not defined by the building where you sit in class. It is defined by what you do with it after you walk out the door. There are people with the finest degrees who have done nothing but defend the powerful. And there are people with ordinary degrees who have defended justice for the powerless. Which one matters more? Karen faltered, her eyes flickering as though searching for a response. The room, however, already knew the answer. Judy had shifted the argument again, away from prestige, away from arrogance, and directly toward purpose. But Judy wasn't done. Her voice grew steadier, her words like iron laid brick by brick. A law degree is not a trophy. It is not a shield for arrogance. It is a responsibility. Mine has worked every day, not for headlines, not for applause, but for justice. Can you say the same about what you've done? The silence that followed was deafening. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing that anything she said would sound hollow. The audience could see it, the reporters could feel it, and the cameras captured it, the moment where arrogance hit the wall of truth and cracked under its own weight. But in her stubbornness, Karen forced one last laugh, a brittle sound that betrayed the cracks in her confidence. You think you've won just because you've got the crowd on your side? She sneered. This is just entertainment. Judy leaned forward once more, her eyes unyielding. No, this is not entertainment. This is a reminder that respect is earned, not mocked. That justice is lived, not performed. And that no matter how loud arrogance tries to be, truth will always be louder. The words landed like thunder, and the courtroom erupted, not in chaos but in applause that broke past the moderator's attempts at order. Karen had doubled down, but in doing so, she had only deepened the pit she stood in. Judge Judy hadn't just defended her law degree. She had transformed the moment into a lesson, a demonstration of why arrogance will always fall before integrity. The applause still echoed, but Judge Judy did not allow it to distract her. She didn't smile, didn't bask in the approval. She remained steady, her posture calm, her eyes locked on Karen with a patience that cut deeper than any outburst could. It was the composure of someone who had weathered storms bigger than this, someone who knew that authority was not about noise, but about unshakable conviction. Karen tried to seize the moment again, lifting her chin as if the audience's reaction had not rattled her. You can talk all you want, she scoffed, but nothing changes the fact that you hide behind your so-called experience. If you were truly great, you'd have gone to the best schools, stood with the best lawyers, argued the biggest cases, but you didn't. You're just a TV judge who thinks her degree makes her special. The words were sharp, but they reeked of desperation. Even the audience sensed it. The mutters that followed weren't of agreement but of disbelief. Karen was digging herself deeper, trying to strike at Judy's legacy with flimsy weapons. But Judge Judy did not react with anger. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice calm but carrying the weight of a gavel striking wood. Do you know what makes a degree powerful? She asked quietly, so quietly that the audience hushed to hear. It is not the name of the university. It is not the shine of a diploma. It is the justice it produces. My degree has protected families from eviction, preserved the rights of the powerless, and reminded this country that no one is above accountability. That is what gives it power. That is what makes it real. Her words didn't just answer Karen's insult. They reframed the entire debate. This was no longer about whether Judy's degree was prestigious enough. It was about the very purpose of the law itself. She was no longer defending herself. She was defending every lawyer who had ever been dismissed, every student who had been told their school wasn't good enough, every voice that had been silenced by arrogance. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing the intensity in her eyes. The reporters scribbled faster, already knowing they were transcribing the moment that would become the headline. And the audience, once divided, was now unified in their silence, leaning into every word. Judge Judy pressed further, her words growing sharper, cutting through Karen's sneers like steel. If your definition of greatness is prestige, then you've misunderstood everything about justice. The law does not live in marble halls and ivory towers. It lives in the lives of the people it touches. It lives in the tenant who keeps her home. It lives in the worker whose rights are defended. It lives in the child who gets a fair chance because the law stood on their side. That is where the law breathes. That is where my degree has lived. Tell me, Karen, where has yours lived? The question landed like a hammer. Karen froze, her mouth slightly open, the smirk that had carried her until now crumbling in real time. She had no answer. None. And the silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was devastating. Judy allowed the silence to stretch, letting it expose the emptiness of Karen's attack. Then, with deliberate calm, she delivered the defining blow. If your degree teaches you to defend power without questioning it, then it is nothing more than a shield for the privileged. But if mine teaches me to stand with the powerless, then it is a sword for justice, and I will always choose the sword. The room erupted. Gasps, applause, even cheers broke out despite the moderator's attempts to restore order. The force of her words had cracked through the veneer of arrogance and struck at something deeper, truth. It wasn't just rhetoric. It was a declaration of values, a reminder that the measure of authority is not found in prestige, but in purpose. Karen sat rigid, her face flushed, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to summon another response, but none came. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, her barbs reduced to ashes in the face of Judy's conviction. For the first time, the room saw not a heckler in control, but a figure exposed, diminished, silenced by her own arrogance. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, her expression calm, almost serene. She did not gloat, did not smile. She allowed the moment to speak for itself. And it did. Because everyone in that room, and soon everyone beyond it, knew they had witnessed something bigger than a debate. They had witnessed the dismantling of arrogance by truth. Outside those walls, the ripple effect would begin immediately. Clips would circulate, headlines would be written, and the defining quote, "A shield for the privileged," or "A sword for justice," would echo across networks and social media. But inside the courtroom, the impact was already complete. Respect had been restored, authority reaffirmed, and Karen left with nothing but the hollow echo of her own mockery. This was Judge Judy's defining blow, not a shout, not a scream, but a truth so sharp that it silenced arrogance and reminded everyone why her name carried weight that no insult could erase. When the session ended, the contrast was undeniable. Karen's mockery had dissolved into silence while Judge Judy's words lingered like a gavel strike that echoed far beyond the courtroom walls. What began as an insult ended as a reminder that respect is not given by arrogance. It is earned through truth, conviction, and justice. In that moment, Judy didn't just win the room. She reminded the world why her voice still carries power.